is Michael Rodriguez, and since I know nobody in this room knows Michael, let me give a little overview. He's our Electronic Resources Librarian right here at UConn. He leads licensing and acquisition for our collections. In addition, he teaches copyright webinars and in-person workshops for nonprofits and academia. He's published dozens of short reviews and journal articles, and was awarded a fellowship from the International Federation of Library Associations. So he handles our contract negotiations with our vendors. So he's going to talk a little bit about fair use today.
Thank you, Jennifer. Let's see if I can go into presenter mode here. Let's see. Ooh, excellent. Wow. I can still see my notes. Good morning, everyone. And I'm delighted to be here to talk to you a little bit about fair use and the context in which it applies, particularly in terms of digital scholarship. So text, but also videos, audio, and the other material of scholarship today. I have a picture of a fair on here. Jupiter doesn't really have anything to do with fair use. I just enjoyed a little wordplay involved there. So as Jennifer said, Michael Rodriguez, and I'm actually now the Licensing and Acquisitions Librarian at UConn Library. That was a recent title change. This slide deck is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license, but you'll find that it's almost entirely pictures. So I don't actually put text on most of my slides, so just bear that in mind. So I guess we can start out by kind of framing how I'm approaching the topic of fair use. And the subtitle of my presentation is Fair Use and then a forward arrow, Copyright. So what do we, digital scholarship, arrow, copyright. So how are we defining scholarship in this context? And first, a little side question. Does anyone recall seeing this image or where it is from? This is actually on the floor of the British Museum. And I thought it was a nice, clever way to segue into scholarship as kind of not only the production of knowledge, but also the distribution of knowledge. So how I'm kind of defining scholarship in this context is really any activity that leads to that production and distribution. So it's not really, scholarship in this context I'm not really viewing as information, right? So information is almost stimuli. So my hand clapping is information. But how you contextualize and understand that information can be constructed as knowledge. So that's really kind of a sweeping definition, right? It can include anything from writing a conventional book or article. It could be tweeting your insights into our anti-mundane conditions. It could be creating an interactive digital exhibit or otherwise sharing your knowledge and insights with others, which we formalize in education. So what about digital? So my kind of definition of scholarship earlier as fundamentally about the distribution as well as the production, I think that segues nicely into a discussion of the digital nature of scholarship today. So what is the distinction really nowadays between digital scholarship and regular scholarship? It's a line that's blurred now, right? Because when we type a paper, and we may do archival research to get to that paper, but we type it onto a laptop, and we forward it to our editors, and we do red lines within that. The paper is then published in an electronic journal online under a e-resource license. So this is kind of, so digital scholarship is really fundamentally everything that happens at a university context and an educational context. And that really segues, I think, into a discussion of rights and responsibilities as producers and distributors of that kind of digital scholarship and education. So we certainly have copyrights, we certainly have copy responsibilities, and it's remarkable how widely these vary. So is copyright law universal? Like, is it consistent across the different countries and jurisdictions? Does anyone know offhand of a particular variation in copyright, say between the United States and a European country?
Well, I think in Spain they had different rules for journals publication versus the United States in terms like with the rights extended, and then now, and that was before the European Union. Now the European Union has their own body of copyright law that differ extremely from the United States, and in China and Japan. So every country has some limitations and boundaries, and then there's stuff that are kind of, it has to be by treaty, and laws can be accepted between different countries, so you have a more standardized copyright, but it doesn't apply to all elements. So I think that we are giving a specific example, that my understanding, that there are commonalities, but the limitation of how long, like life plus 70 is not our versus them. But they sound like in the public domain content. So it varies, right?
It really does. So there have been efforts to kind of standardize, globalize, in a sense, copyright law. So there's been the Berne Convention, there's the Marrakesh Treaty, which is coming up, that talks about the right of people and organizations to make content accessible that would otherwise not be accessible to users with disabilities, even if that means some kind of violation of the copyright. But generally speaking, there's U.S. copyright law is actually surprisingly open in comparison to that of other countries. Australia, for example, has a rather fascinating notion that unpublished work really never clearly enters the public domain. So that is obviously a big challenge for archives or for folks who are working with unpublished materials, because there's really no clear copyright term associated with that content. But in the context of liabilities, copyright in the educational and nonprofit context, we hear a lot of instances in which there are lawsuits, and the damages, statutory damages alone can run up to $150,000 per infringement. But in the vast majority of perceived copyright infringements, generally the worst that will happen to someone making a good faith, fair use effort in an educational context is a takedown notice or a cease and desist letter. So you get an email from the publisher telling you that you didn't have the right to put this image up on your personal website, please take it down. In some cases, that takedown notice is going to go directly to your internet service provider. So if you posted a video on YouTube, that notice will typically go directly to YouTube or to WordPress if you're hosting a free site on WordPress. So that's kind of the liability piece. And YouTube is actually getting rid of this beautiful yellow unhappy face that appears when when a video is taken down in response to a DMCA notice, which is sad. I loved seeing it.
Something, I don't know if people notice this, but if you do a Google search, especially that for like videos for any type, so if the video you're looking have been uploaded illegally, they will put a note saying that the link to those places have been taken down or removed under the Millennium Act copyright law. So it's interesting that even a Google search can be, they can tell them like, don't show this link or we will remove it because it's illegal.
Particularly in the case of image searches, yeah. I mean, a lot of the image searches you do, if you scroll down to the bottom of the first page of results, you see that not all results are being displayed. I actually really liked how you, Peter, kind of localized the concept of author rights and of contracts and looking at kind of UConn policies. I was going in the same direction. So one point that I wanted to bring out, in addition to the university policies piece, and UConn is a unionized environment, so we have faculty and staff contracts. And those contracts may or may not include intellectual property clauses. So interestingly, in the case of about 50% of the people in this room, we're staff, we're librarians. We are falling under the University of Connecticut Professional Employees Association contract, I remembered it. And interestingly, that contract is silent on the issue of copyright. So in that case, the sole arbiter would be, in fact, the university's policies and the handbook and the HR policies. The faculty contract, the American Association of Faculty of University Professors, it actually does call out intellectual property. And it does so, and I mean, faculty really have extraordinarily strong intellectual property rights, whether it's digital scholarship, whether it's traditional published research, or whether it's actually materials that they create for their courses, regardless of whether those courses are online or not. However, the bit that I pulled out of the faculty contract, the AAUP contract, actually highlights, I'm going to walk around, actually highlights the use of copyrighted materials in online classes. So if the faculty member is putting material into an online course, into Husky CT, into Blackboard, that faculty member agrees that all materials collected and employed in the course by that faculty member have been cleared for use in the course, whatever that means, and that the faculty member owns or has permission from the owner to use the material in the course, or that the material may be employed under fair use rules. So they did call out fair use, which is nice. You don't have to seek permission for everything. But this is kind of interesting language because it does really foreground the individual faculty member's responsibility to have a good understanding of how to apply fair use and how to seek permission for materials that they include in courses, which is good practice regardless of the context. As far as graduate students, the Graduate Student Association contract, I think, is silent on the issue of copyright, except as it pertains to like blatant course materials like syllabi and such. But generally speaking, this is the faculty contract. So attribution is obviously a fundamental part of any scholarship. You have to cite where your ideas and your quoted expressions came from. But does attribution, if you properly attribute a work, does that mean you are automatically not guilty of infringing on copyright? Several heads are shaking. So no. So attribution and infringement are kind of completely different concepts. As I think Peter was saying, one is plagiarism is and attribution are fundamentally ethical and professional issues, whereas infringement is legal and legally enforceable. Now it is important to stress that attribution is important in the context of fair use because if you properly attribute information, images, etc., that you take from another source, that can bolster your good faith defense if it does come to a cease and desist order or the unlikely event of a lawsuit. You can demonstrate that you did at least some due diligence in providing attribution, and it's not a waiver of your responsibility, but it's a sign of good faith effort. It's a sign that you are not being sloppy in your reproduction and use of other people's work, which is a nice baseline to establish in the event of legal action. So this is my kind of quick and dirty definition of copyright. The exclusive legal right to reproduce, distribute, modify, and perform original works of authorship fixed in a tangible medium of expression. The word tangible came up previously, and a good example that I always like to go back to is the notion of choreography, right? So dancing. So if the dance simply exists in the moment and it's not captured in any way, then that's not copyrightable, right? But if it is written out into a very specific process and it is original enough and creative enough and not random, then that could potentially then that becomes a tangible form when it is written down or when it is filmed and it's original enough to qualify. And that's kind of the original works of authorship comes in, is when a work has some kind of unique human creative aspect or originality to it. This is why data and facts cannot be copyrighted. And interestingly, works created by animals cannot be copyrighted either. Does anyone remember the famous monkey selfie? Yeah, so essentially, that was when a photographer in Britain, I think, gave a monkey a camera, and the monkey took a truly delightful accidental selfie with it. And naturally, the photographer wanted to sell that picture because it went viral, was garnering all this publicity. And courts actually found that this photo was in the public domain because there was no human authorship behind it. It was simply an animal serendipitously taking this photo with a camera that a guy gave him. Now, whether the concept of animals having copyright, that's a somewhat different discussion. Right now, they don't. So we mentioned that facts and ideas are uncopyrightable. So some other things that are uncopyrightable might be common knowledge. So I think pretty much it's common knowledge. Everyone knows that World War II began in 1939. That's not really a copyrightable piece of information. And other things that are really not copyrightable are kind of processes and things of that nature that are really covered under patents or trademarks. Logos would be trademarked, for example, not copyrighted. We talked briefly earlier about copyright duration. So typically nowadays it's life of the author plus 70 years. But this is interesting because the duration of copyright has dramatically increased over time. So this is the original excerpt from the U.S. Constitution that established that enshrined the concept of copyright in federal law. And this was, 1789, something like that? So what was the initial term of copyright when this notion was first established in law in the 18th century? How long did copyright extend? Life of the author plus 70 years, a bit longer, 5 years? Close. It was 14 years with the possibility of an extra 14-year extension. And that's 28 years versus the potential 150 years that exists today. And that duration has been kind of stepped up over time. And really the reason for that is the increased commercialization of copyright, right? So originally it was understood as the goal being to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their writings and discoveries. So copyright should have applied as originally construed only to the extent necessary to facilitate this social welfare goal, this societal well-being goal, and scientific progress. And obviously that's evolved over time. Evolved, devolved, mutated. So certainly one natural way to use other people's work, other copyrighted works, is to seek permission to do that, whether by filling out a form on a publisher website or reaching out to the rights holder in some other way. Now, of course, that can be a little bit complicated. So, for example, one way that leaps to mind, if anyone's been on ResearchGate or academia.edu, oftentimes you can find article metadata and title and such listed. And then there's a button to say contact author to request a copy of the work. But the author may not be the rights holder if the author assigned copyright. So sometimes finding the person who actually does have the authority under law to give you the right to do this, to make these changes or to redistribute the work, whatever the case may be, sometimes it's hard to identify that person or to get permission. You also have the problem of Orphan Works, where it's not clear where really nobody knows who the owner or the rights holder of that work is. So it's usually, typically if you're quoting a reasonable amount, or if you're taking a piece of material from someone else's work, and you're integrating it into your own, and you're in some way, and its use is reasonable, and that's obviously a judgment call to some extent, then you don't necessarily have to seek permission. And we'll go into that in just a bit. The law does build in some safeguards, and more have emerged over time. So the first one is the public domain, right? So this is kind of the national park, everything, and the national park is public property. So it's technically it belongs to the federal government, which owns it on behalf of the people. So it's nobody's property to some extent. One can argue. But the public domain essentially includes all of these works. So it includes non-copyrighted works. And interestingly, these can be works that are from the 1940s or 50s or 60s, when authors were required to register and renew their copyright. So you get kind of outlier cases like the film Night of the Living Dead, if anyone's familiar with that. Awesome black and white zombie film. That film is actually in the public domain because George Romero, or the director, the rights holder company, simply neglected to file a copyright extension. So it is now in the public domain, and you can find it on Internet Archive and watch it to your heart's content. Federal government works are typically also in the public domain, unless they're written by contractors, in which case other rights may apply, or if the work is by a state or local government, which typically do retain copyright. Also, anything published prior to 1923 is in the public domain. And nowadays, you can actually dedicate works to the public domain. So you can publish your work under a license, under a Creative Commons license, CC0 as it's called, that actually essentially donates your article or your picture or whatever the case may be into the public domain. So people can use it and adapt it and modify it and distribute it without necessarily even having to give you attribution, which is really helpful in the case of images. Creative Commons is a great way for authors to license their work in ways that do not slam the iron gate on the right of other people to kind of reuse that information. So you can release your work under an attribution license, in which case other people can do anything they want with your work as long as they give you due attribution, and as long as they do not use the work in such a way as to imply that you endorse their use of the work. And there's also a non-commercial clause, so you can prohibit use for which the primary purpose is making a profit. You can also release your work under a share-alike license. So, and that's kind of a gray area, but essentially share-alike would mean that anyone can use the work as long as they release derivatives of that work under the same license or under a similar license. And then you get the non-derivatives too, which you can only share the work if it's exactly the same as it was first published. So you can post the article on your website, for example, but you cannot go in and modify it in some way. So this is the fair use clause from the US Code. And it's actually rather a fascinating read. So the US law does build in a lot of exceptions and exemptions for copyright, primarily for the benefit of libraries and educators. And this is really the gold standard for those exceptions. So you can use a fair use analysis in order to make the case that you have the right under the law to take the work and use it in particular ways without having to seek permission, without paying royalties, and if the work is still under copyright. The four factors that you need to consider, and that courts will also consider when making this analysis, are the purpose and character of the use. So are you using the work to make money? Are you using the work for educational purposes? And various other concepts that fall within that factor one. The second is the nature of the copyrighted work. So Interestingly, creative works tend to be more rigorously protected than nonfiction ones. So poems and novels tend to be more strongly protected in court cases than strictly non-fictional works like a history book or a scientific treatise. And my sense is that's because the assumption is that more unique human creative effort went into a poem than into a history book, which is kind of reframing and interpreting and presenting, in many cases, existing knowledge or new knowledge that builds on older knowledge. Third factor is the amount and substantiality of the portion used related to the copyrighted work as a whole. So in this context, you have to look primarily at the raw amount of information that's being used or being copied. You hear the phrase 10% of a book or one chapter. You can't really put a numerical quality on it. It really depends on the context that you're using the resource. And then, of course, you get the effect of the use on the potential market or value of the work. So by reusing this work in this way, are you depreciating the market or the potential market for this resource so the publisher or the rights holder can make money off the work, and you're impacting that in some way. The right of first publication came up earlier. Generally, rights holders and authors do have the right to publish first, so that can become an issue, but it's not a determining factor. You can apply a fair use analysis even to unpublished work or to privately published work. It's kind of a classic case study in the concept of derivative use. So if we go back to section 1, the purpose and character of the use, courts have really drawn a distinction between derivative and transformative use. Derivative use essentially being when you modify a work without fundamentally changing it, right? And again, this is quite open to interpretation. So in this particular case, back in 2008, I believe, an artist took an Associated Press news photo and basically recolored it, added the word hope to it, and started distributing and selling that work as a poster. It was very popular. The Associated Press sued the artist, and they won because, in the interpretation of the court, the changes that the artist made to the photographer's work were not so dramatically different as to constitute a transformative work. And a transformative work is essentially when the meaning of the work is changed in such a way as to create an essentially new work. Is anyone familiar with the concept of humanism? No? It's actually a really neat idea. So back in the 1970s, this guy took an old Victorian public domain book, and what he actually did was recolor the pages and pull out key sections, just tiny little phrases and snippets. And he did that for the entire book. It's many, many pages. And actually created a kind of a running narrative that reflected the pictorial patterns that he was drawing on the pages of the book. Now, this book was in the public domain, so fair use was not really at issue. But to my mind, this is really a classic case of transformative use, when you're really creating a new work by using this older work. Right. So I would probably hesitate to take the entire work and do this to it if it's still under copyright and then try to publish it or put it out there. But for the purposes of a class project, for the purposes of a digital exhibit, it may be possible to do that in a limited way. Nature of the work, so we kind of talked briefly about that already, creative versus nonfiction. Amount and substantiality, so I kind of did talk about the amount, but the substantiality part of it is also rather interesting. So even if it's actually a relatively small portion of the overall work, you can still get in trouble if you pull out what the court has referred to as the heart of the work. So, as an example, back in 1985, the Nation magazine actually published about 300-400 page excerpts from President Gerald Ford's autobiography as part of an article looking at Gerald Ford. The problem was that particular portion of the biography was in which Ford was talking about his pardon of Richard Nixon. And the only reason anyone would ever read a biography of Gerald Ford is to find out why he pardoned Richard Nixon. To add to the matter, the publisher of the biography, Harper & Row, had an exclusive agreement with Time magazine to publish portions of the biography, and the Nation preempted that publication. So first they kind of published a heart of the work, the one that everybody would have been interested in. Second, they may have potentially impacted the market for the work, and they certainly impacted the contract the publisher had with Time magazine, because Time magazine backed out of the contract. So, and thereby incurred the publisher some degree of loss. Yes?
Michael, so go back one slide. The amount, although it's not stipulated in the actual fair use language, libraries have traditionally ascribed, 10%?
Right.
A number to that. If we don't use that as a basis, how does someone determine what is an appropriate? I mean, that's something that libraries just kind of came up with, but how do we determine what is a fair use amount?
So that the 10% figure is an excellent shorthand, and there are similar kind of best practices documents for the amount of the number of seconds of a song that you can use, that sort of thing. So that best practices information is out there. But it really does come down to the specific context and the circumstance in which you're using the work. And I tend to interpret it a little bit more liberally than some would. But generally 10% is a good figure, especially, again, if it's kind of in the educational context, and if, for example, if you're putting the material behind a password-protected Husky CT login rather than just popping it out onto a personal website for the whole world to see. So there are kind of a lot of kind of contextual factors that go into it, but you're right that the 10% is kind of a good shorthand for amount.
Some of these different aspects of fair use, there are best practices out there for people to look at. You don't have to just come up with it all on your own.
Exactly. The ARL, Association of Research Libraries, actually has a somewhat older 2014 code of best practices in the library context. There's also a really good one put out by the School of Information at American School. I think the URL is cmsimpacts.org. And they actually have really good documentation and standards for videos and audio as well. So no, you definitely don't have to kind of operate in a vacuum of guidance when doing a fair use analysis.
I think it's important to understand when you are applying fair use in your research or in writing. So the amount, even because it's a little amount, doesn't mean that you cannot be in copyright infringement, because it's the sustainability aspect that is also important. Like I'm thinking in poetry, if you have a poem that only has 4 stanzas and you publish 2, you are in copyright violation because half of the work is there. So probably you're only allowed to do like 1 phrase, and that wouldn't be fair use. So how you balance that, it depends how big or how small is the work and what are you picking. Because you pick the more important phrase of that point, probably again you can be in infringement, and that's the part that is when you balance fair use versus when you need to request permission. Because it's not that you're going to use it, but then when fair use apply versus asking permission to use that key element from that other work in your work.
Right. And I think the 10% is particularly applicable to the educational context. If you want to share material with your students, for example, 10% might be excessive depending on the context if you're talking about actually republishing the work. So 10% of a published monograph could be an entire chapter. You definitely would need to seek permission to republish an entire chapter in your own edited volume, for example. And then market impact, we kind of talked about that. This would also refer to the potential market impact, though. So we certainly would see this a lot with textbooks and workbooks in the educational context, and I'll talk about those in a bit. Let's do something fun. So memes and GIFs, they're everywhere. Twitter actually lets you embed GIFs or GIFs, depending how you prefer to pronounce the G, into your tweets nowadays. You can find them almost everywhere. I see them in presentations all the time. But they usually do take a still from a copyrighted work, a single image, and possibly some of the wording. So what is your sense of this? Do you think this could be construed as a copyright infringement? Could you get a takedown notice if you put a GIF on your website or on your social media account?
Usually not. That would be because that's satire and parody, and that's protected, right? As far as I know, that's one of the cases that you can get copyright material and use it because you are doing a satire and parody are covered by copyright. Yeah, fair use. But that's fair use? Yeah, that's fair use.
Yeah, and parody is a key potential part of transformative use that I didn't mention.
Yeah,
so you can take an existing work and transform it in order to create a satire or some kind of humorous commentary.
Oh, there are exceptions?
There are exceptions.
Not a satire.
Exactly.
Parody.
A parody, yes.
Parody, right?
Yeah, parody.
So
Parody only.
And I would doubt whether this would constitute a parody of the original work.
And that's the thing too, is that memes are very different. So in this particular meme, it's not really a parody, right? Because it's taking the exact words of this character from The Lord of the Rings and his image without transforming it in any particular way. So what are some other copyright fair use guidelines that could come into play here when looking at the copyright of this image?
Installation is enforceable because even if you breaking copyright, if the copyright holder do not see as that it's not worth the money to go after everybody in Twitter and Facebook to go after them, or even Facebook, then yeah, even if it's infringement, they may not prosecute. So what is the risk there? So they say the cost to prosecute will be higher than the cost to let it slide. But if that affects the rights of the copywriter when they don't go and defend their rights.
Yeah, and I think in this context, I mean, memes and GIFs have almost been institutionalized by social media. So Twitter, for example, now has the built-in feature where you can post these. So it's an interesting question, and my personal interpretation, and I may be quite wrong about this, is that this might be a good example of a reproduction that is so insubstantial and minimal that it really is it's not going to prompt an infringement case, at least not a reasonable infringement case. Now, certainly if you were publishing it, again, if you're reifying it in print form, you could be a little more cautious. But if it's reproduced on a website...
Well, you're not making any money, but that doesn't... But even when you're not making money, doesn't mean that you're not committing copyright infringement. So that's one factor, it's not the only factor.
Right, the commercial value.
It's a risk assessment that you have to make. How likely, if I put this out there, is anybody going to say anything or sue me?
What I see sometimes coming up is, faculty who are writing a paper and then they want to discuss a meme in their paper. And so now they're like, maybe you have a fair use or a de minimis claim when you make the meme, and then the faculty member who's discussing the meme in their paper, right? Like now they have to negotiate with the publisher on behalf, and I would tend to call that a fair use, of a meme. You can't even figure out who created the thing very often. So
Yeah, it's.
But we had, when I was at Cornell in the library, they wanted to take the Ryan Gosling meme and say things about the library to post on the Facebook.
He's like,
Oh.
hey girl.
Ah.
And, hey girl, the library is the place to be, and post that on the Facebook site, which everybody was doing. But we said, technically that would constitute advertising, and advertising under New York law is a right of publicity that belongs to the person, and we'd be in violation of that, not to mention potentially the copyright of the photographer who took the original photograph of them. So we couldn't do it.
Institutional risk assessment can often be very different from individual personal risk assessment because an institution might have deep pockets that might make litigation more useful, right? And also, you can just decide that, this seems like a reasonable thing, whereas an institution sometimes has to make decisions that are not based on reason. I don't know why that's
All the
true, but
time.
it seems to be true often.
But I think it's all about context. I think context is always key when you make decision on risk or copyright, and because in the context, like if I want to take this and have a class about it, fair use privilege will be behind it. But like you said,
Or including it in the article that.
that is
That you're commenting or criticizing.
At that point.
But when you do it, like you said, like you use it to advertise a service, that's a totally different set of rules. So what is the context of what we use then, and what is the risk, and also what is the interest of the copyright holder? Like for the Lord of the Rings, will they want to go after Facebook, after all the social media people that support them and watch the movies? For them, this is like, it's advertisement, we are being advertisement. So I don't know, it's one of those interesting situations because, it is no parody. It's more like, well, it is and it's not. Because parody is about, it's making fun of Lord of the Rings. But the statement is something else about. That is external, it's satire.
If you go through the full fair use analysis, you can come out, but I would not want people to, there's another doctrine that we don't often think about, the de minimis doctrine. And, if you think about what a screen cap is, it is 1/16 of a second from, in this case, a more than 2 hour, if I recall correctly, movie, right? So that is 1/16 of a second times 60 seconds times 60 minutes times 2, whatever. It's a lot, right? So it's such a tiny fraction that you may not even feel it's worth it to do the fair use analysis. You may say this is such a trivial, trifling amount of potential copyright infringement that it is de minimis. And I think that's something you could play with and think about. So I think fair use is not the only tool we have to think about screenshots. And it does, of course, have to do also with how you're using it. But I love the doctrine, so don't think
It's a lovely doctrine.
A piece from a movie versus a photograph, it would be completely different.
Yeah, if
consideration.
you're looking
Yeah.
at it for de minimis, it would be a very different kind of thing.
Yeah. Totally true.
It is interesting that you brought up the concept of the right to publicity, because you see this, so memes and GIFs are usually, the kind of humorous quality about them, but you can also make GIFs of major sporting events, so of a FIFA match, of the moment when that amazing goal hits the net. And probably whatever company had exclusive rights to broadcasting that match may not necessarily be happy to have hundreds of these GIFs floating around. Can they do anything about it? Probably not. But they could argue that it impacts their market for their exclusive broadcast rights.
So there are interesting questions around the copyright of these sporting events, because those sporting events themselves are not per se copyrighted. The webcast, the broadcast is, it's fixed and so forth, but the original underlying thing may not be actually copyrightable. So there is in fact a broadcast treaty that's trying to nail down that last piece of it, but with any luck that will not pass.
Yes, globalization has has its costs.
Well, there's a different thing. If somebody is in that game and they use their camera to record that moment and they're uploading that, then they're not part of that broadcasting rights. They're not being violated. They're using their own medium. And I don't know, like that the ticket say like you are giving up, you're not supposed to.
They usually say you're not supposed to.
But who enforce that? That's the question. Yeah.
Everybody does.
I know, we can go hours talking about it.
We really can.
So keep going.
But that actually segues nicely into something that I probably won't have time for, but I did want to talk at some point about museum photographs. So I threw this in here. So classroom plays. So a lot of times in an English class, for example, or a theater class, you do put on a play in the classroom. The students get the script and they act it out. Is that a problem under copyright, to take a copyrighted play and enact it in the classroom?
Are you going to record it?
That's the key. So if it's simply a part of a physical classroom instruction context, then obviously you can do that. That's enshrined in the copyright laws. However, if you are then taking that and broadcasting that, if you're putting the video on YouTube, or if you're streaming it in some way, then that leads to the fair use analysis discussion. So, are you creating a substitute for the original play? Whose market are you actually impacting here? I'd be kind of curious to see if this has come up in any of your contexts.
Good question. Again, it's like, if you think about K to 12, they always have the elementary kids doing a play, and their parents are recorded, they tape it and upload it in Facebook and share it to the world and YouTube and whatever. Again, it's like who is going to go after them? So I think that I don't know what the law says, if they can or cannot. I think it's free use of it. I mean, they don't do the whole thing, but I think that let's not confuse, like, when people upload saying, who is responsible to go after this? And like you say, like in YouTube, they may not go after you, they go to YouTube and Amazon and say, take that down. But yeah, so do we have the right to do it? I never been clear about it. Like, how far is what we're doing that can go beyond the classroom? Be K to 12, be university setting.
Right, and I mean, I think that you're right. The risk assessment, the risk is extremely low, and chances are that in the unlikely event that the rights holder doesn't like that you're reenacting the play and putting it on YouTube, they will issue a takedown notice to YouTube, and that will be the end of that. And sometimes with some of these discussions, we can. I feel that sometimes we can go in circles, but it ultimately does come down to a risk assessment and the level of risk that you personally or you institutionally are comfortable with, and applying whatever rationale you have to get there. Yes?
As a faculty member, just what are when, and it sounds like it's not common or even rare, but let's say it's not common that someone is sued for, let's say it's inadvertent, but you're sharing something, and what are the typical circumstances in which there is a suit, a successful suit? What are the circumstances? Is it, is there examples or representative examples? Because again, as a faculty member, sometimes I'll share articles. I try not to do it electronically because I think that has more potential for distribution than, say, giving somebody a copy of something. Mm-hmm. What are the circumstances in which that faculty find themselves sued by a publisher or the like for again, they, in good faith, they thought they were sharing something, they weren't intending to infringe, but nonetheless they have. Are there examples of that?
It is quite rare for an individual faculty member to be sued. In fact, offhand, I can't really think of any particular circumstances strictly in the educational setting. Institutions have certainly been sued.
I see. Okay.
And I think the Georgia State example came up. They're using putting a large number of book chapters from Cambridge University Press books on course reserve, but that was kind of a known institutional practice as opposed to a single faculty member inadvertently posting a somewhat large portion of the work. The other thing,
systematic practice. That was the issue. Was less that it happened, but it was a systematic infringement.
Systematic is an excellent word choice in that context. Yes.
I would also say it was really that the publishers at that point were trying to. It was impact litigation on the part of the publishers and the Copyright Clearance Society. So they were actually targeting a number of different universities to try to actually create this case. It's not that Georgia State's policies were actually that far out of what most people are doing. And certainly they're not now. They were really just trying to make an example and really create a precedent that electronic reserves, is unlawful.
Fees or something.
So it sounds like more the cease and desist is typically you start ignoring that, then that's different. But it sounds like that's more you typically that might be a warning. Again, if you inadvertently do something, someone might say, hey, please stop doing that. This is.
Yeah, that's typical, I think. In my academia.edu example, the takedown notices, again, from Elsevier, I believe they went directly to the hosting company, to academia.edu. And certainly you would receive a notice of that. For example, if your copyright agreement prohibits you from distributing the published version, like the version of record with the publisher's stamp and everything on it, usually that version of record the publisher does try to retain that exclusively. But you can oftentimes, depending on your author agreement, post and share preprints or postprints of your work. But if perhaps you posted the version of record not having truly understood the implications of the contract, then that version will just be taken down and you'll get an alert from academia.edu that this happened. But typically, it's just not worth it unless they're trying to set an example to invest in a lawsuit, with exceptions.
I was just going to also add SSRN. Are there any people who deposit with SSRN in the room? The Social Sciences Research Network. The legal field does. And SSRN was recently purchased by Elsevier, and they started, at least by some accounts, started taking down articles that they believed would be under copyright, even in some cases where the author had in fact negotiated for the right to retain it. And so I guess I tell that little anecdote to say, even if a publisher sends you a cease and desist, it might be worth it to go back to your own agreement and see if you have retained the rights, or in fact say, hey, show me the agreement where I said, because they may not have kept it. So most disputes, especially between like a business and an individual, will resolve with sort of an exchange of letters, a possibility, but they can be intimidating. But what I guess I'm saying is you don't have to be too intimidated. You can actually respond back. And just to kind of further add, just 1 second, like most things that actually go to litigation are going to be between competitors, right? Like, so a business to business, like a university and a publisher, or a publisher and a publisher, or a publisher and a movie company, or a photographer and another photographer, right? So comparable levels. It's much rarer because it's not worth it for a movie industry to sue an individual usually, right?
Yeah. Well, I can also see that if I use let's say a chapter from a book, and I could imagine some publishers might view that favorably. If someone likes the chapter, they might buy the book. It's not like they're not going to buy the book, but again, assuming it's a small amount, I can see how it'd be a positive thing for a publisher to get essentially some marketing, again, of a limited amount.
They might feel positively,
knows,
or they might not. But
Yeah.
you want to see, like, is it just me, or is it like me and my institution, or this other publisher, because they may feel differently, and they may have a different risk profile than you.
Yeah. Okay.
It does vary too based on the publisher. I mean, some are pretty laissez-faire, others are quite assertive about maintaining and enforcing their rights, their exclusive rights.
So you still have the right for trade use to use articles in your class for the students. So it's also like you have to see like, what is the
One more
context?
slide.
Years.
So there's no saying you're posting your personal website.
Right.
the whole
Yeah, I'm more
article.
thinking about classroom.
Yeah, so in the classroom is a different context.
Okay.
So fair use, apply, and what we're talking about earlier is depending how much and
Yeah.
how linking is involved. So there's all these other things that not necessarily that they can send you a letter, but they may be wrong in their argument. So you cannot just accept it. You should go and check your legal counsel or your university that hey, this makes sense.
Yes,
So,
okay.
Yeah, it was an excellent case. Actually, building on that, there was an excellent case recently in which a company that owned the music rights to, I think it was a Prince song, had a takedown notice to YouTube for a video that had the song playing in the background while a baby was dancing and the mom was laughing and filming it. And YouTube took that down, but I believe ultimately it was assessed that that was not an infringement upon the ownership, upon the rights of the music holder. Given the context in which this was happening, it qualified under fair use. Teach Act, really quick, it actually does not apply to UConn currently because the institution as a whole needs to be fully compliant with all of the exceptions and the protocols and such that are built into the Teach Act. So generally in the educational context at UConn, you do rely heavily on fair use. And this is kind of my final segue. So scholarship is really fundamentally built on fair use, right? On the ability to have that exchange and flow and sharing of ideas and reusage of each other's works. So don't be afraid to use it, but just approach it with a full understanding of the context and seek guidance where necessary. And we are actually at time, so I'm happy to take any questions over lunch. Carolyn?
I would also maybe say another takeaway for the whole morning is keep your contracts.
Yep.
Keep your transfer agreements. You may not think you'll need it, but in a few years you may, so. hang on to them.
Especially in the case of SRRN. Thank you very much.